Our next speaker is also well qualified to speak on UN. He is the author of the book, The Fearful Master. And this is also available out in the rooms. Mr. Griffiths has had an ideal preparation for this difficult task in still another way. He grew up on the platform. In 1947, when only 15 years old and a sophomore at the Redford High School, Detroit, Michigan, he entered the $25,000 annual oratorical contest sponsored by the Hearst newspapers. He won the national title that year as the top high school orator in the entire country. Appropriately enough, the subject of his winning speech was Patrick Henry, whose famous choice of liberty or death became the spark that first kindled the flame of American independence and freedom. It is to the protection and preservation of that flame that Mr. Griffin has dedicated his life. As a senior in high school, Eddie was a teenage master of ceremonies on his own CBS network radio program called Make Way for Truth, and we'll ask God to forgive you for that, Ed. Upon graduation from high school, Mr. Griffin was awarded a Regents Alumni Scholarship to the University of Michigan on the basis of a statewide competitive scholastic examination. He majored in speech and helped work his way through college as a radio announcer and news commentator over WUOM, a local radio station in Ann Arbor. He graduated in 1953 with a Bachelor of Arts degree. There followed work as an assistant TV director at WWJ-TV, the NBC affiliate in Detroit. I don't know whether that was a promotion over CBS or not. 2 years of military service and several years with one of the large insurance companies as a specialist in group insurance. He rose rapidly, attained a responsible position in sales management for the Southern California region. It is my pleasure to present to you G. Edward Griffin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gaydosh. I asked Mr. Gaydosh at the beginning of the program, honest I did, not to mention that business about all the speech background, because usually it leads people to expect so much, and I have so little to offer, really. Anybody can work for CBS. I'll let you in a little secret, ladies and gentlemen. You seem like a real good crowd, and I know that I don't have to convince you on hardly anything I'm going to say tonight, and I'm sure you won't tell anybody, but the one thing that was not mentioned in my biography is that I'm a member of the John Birch Society. And while I'm confessing things, I'll really tell you the whole truth. It's really worse than that. I'm also on the staff of the John Birch Society. As you know, I come from California, and it was about 2 years ago that I was demoted from chapter leader to major coordinator there. And I was, I believe that too, by the way. I was given the special job of ditch digger out there. Now, I'm not kidding. This was my job. I was, well, not exactly digging ditches. It was my job to travel up and down the state of California and get people to help me dig canals or stream beds for the flow of water, because, you know, we have quite a problem of water in California. We had the idea, even back then, this was several years ago, that someday we might need these. And, of course, you all know there's a lot of gold in California, and we just wanted to make sure in some possible future election year when the election rains came that there would be a mainstream of gold water there. So. Well, there's a lot of digging yet to be done back there, but we did do a lot prior to, last year when I gave up my particular responsibilities for recruitment and organization of the John Birch Society within the state of California. Now, that brings me up to the present situation. Back in those pre-Gold Rush days, when I would travel around putting thousands of miles on my poor beat-up station wagon and extra years on myself, Mr. Barron, oh, by the way, thank you for your very kind words, but you don't know how old I really am. 97,000 miles on my little Buick station wagon and about 85 years on me. But back in those pre-Gold Rush days, we used to put little meetings on telling people about this little club I belonged to, and usually at the end of the meeting, two questions would come up. Somebody would always ask me about that alleged statement allegedly made in an alleged manuscript, unpublished, by one of our members about a president of the United States. And I used to give 45-minute book reviews on that, and then when I was done with that, came the next question, is why on earth are you people opposed to the United Nations? Don't you know it's our last best hope for peace? What do you want? War? What would you replace it with? Etc., you know? And I used to get so frustrated because by this time it was quite late, as it is now, and people were getting a little itchy to go home, and some people were getting up and leaving. And I used to think, oh, if I just had a book on that subject. And as Mr. Barron has pointed out, it wasn't until very recently that there was anything really current and comprehensive on the subject. And I used to say, oh, I could write a book on that subject and hope that I would convince them with my superior knowledge just by saying I could, and I hope they never asked me to expound, you see. Well, finally, about a year ago, I decided to write a book on the United Nations, and I plunged into some research. The title of this book, as you have undoubtedly heard about 100 times in the last couple of days, is The Fearful Master. That confuses some people. They don't know what I'm talking about with that title. Well, if it sounds a little vaguely familiar to you, it's because you have been reading your American history, and you've probably been reading the statements by that original right-wing extremist, conservative isolationist by the name of George Washington. George Washington said in a speech, "Government is not reason, it is not eloquence, it is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearful master." And in that little gem of wisdom, I found everything I wanted to say about the United Nations. And so that became the title of the book. Now, thinking of the title, by the way, reminds me of about a month ago, I made a very short circuit of speeches here on the East Coast, and one of my stops was in Rochester, New York. And my assigned topic for that night was my favorite one, the John Birch Society. But it had already been announced that this book was on the press and it was due to come off, and so the word was getting around. And as I got off the plane in Rochester, in the taxicab on the way over to the hotel, I heard on the radio, the taxicab driver had his radio on, and I heard the newscaster suddenly come on and say there was a fellow by the name of Ed Griffin going to be speaking at the hotel that night on the John Birch Society, and he had just written a new book called The Fearful Monster. Well, you don't really understand the significance of how tremendous that was until you know something about Rochester. That happens to be the home of Xerox Corporation. It also is the home of Kodak, and these two organizations have probably pumped more money, tax-exempt money, into the United Nations Association than any other two corporations in the United States. And the city of Rochester has, I believe, the largest per capita membership of the American Association for the United Nations in the whole country. And so with the radio blabbing all day long that somebody was going to speak on the fearful monster, you can imagine what happened. They really turned out. And I can say, Mr. Barron, that I have spoken before audiences like Ambassador Stevenson likes to speak. Stevenson likes to speak before. A very pro-UN crowd. I'm sure that over 80% of these people were members of the AAUN. And after I saw all these people turn out, I thought, I really should have named the book The Fearful Monster. But actually that would have another very significant meaning because, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you do believe it from what you've said and indicated by your applause to what Mr. Byron has said. We do have down there in New York right now a building on the East River which houses a very fearful monster indeed, a Frankenstein that is doomed to destroy us if we do not destroy it soon. Now, after my research, getting back to the topic of my own endeavors here, I spent several months, about 9 weeks to 2 months in research before I started to write a single thing. And I unearthed the most fantastic mystery story that could ever be written. It was a real whodunit. The only trouble is, you can't tell this mystery story or this whodunit in the narrative form. It has to be told in the documentary form, especially when you're dealing with people who don't want to believe that whodunit did it. You gotta prove it. And you'd think that after having written a book on the subject of the United Nations, it'd be a snap to give a speech, but it isn't. It becomes doubly hard because there's so much I want to say, and yet I know that I can't do it in the documentary form without hauling out reams and reams of long quotations and facts, names, dates, and places, which is perhaps okay on the printed page, but I have sat in enough audiences in my life to have sympathy for both the eardrums and the other parts of the anatomy which get involved with this sort of thing. So I'm just going to have to leave you up to your own resources to dig some of these specifics out of my book. The other day I had a very liberal friend come over to the house, and strangely enough, he's one of the few people, I guess, the few people I know as friends who did not know that I was a member of the John Birch Society. Hadn't seen him for a long, long time, and I just assumed that he knew it. And it suddenly became very obvious about 2/3 of the way through the conversation that he did not know it. So anyway, I had just received the first edition of my book. It had just come in the mail, and so as he left, I said, I've got something, a very immodest gift I want to make to you. Here's a new book that I just wrote, just dashed it off. And here, and he looked at it, and of course right away his face turned red, and he said, oh, we could have a good argument on this. I said, well, there's my argument. You write a book and bring it back, and then we'll carry it on from there. Well, perhaps that is at the point where I should just say thank you and sit down. I should just say, here's my argument, and let's take it from there. And I will try and cut my argument short. It would be very kind to you, but I'm afraid the program committee would probably be unhappy with me if I did that. So let me give you, at least in a very brief summary, a very glancing review, some of the things that I found and some of the conclusions which I have reached personally. Now, first of all, I want to make one point very clear. I do not present both sides of the issue. If you want the other side, I suggest that you go home and turn on your radio, your television set, read your nightly newspaper or your magazine, and you get the other side. That's all we have had is the other side. Now, I have not given myself the luxury, however, and I do mean luxury, of using as reference material for my little study those sources which are hostile to the UN. Oh, there's no limit to the kind of a case you can build against something if you just go to people who don't like it and use their opinions and their ideas. Oh, we could have done a beautiful job. But I have purposely given myself the handicap of using primarily those sources which are friendly to the United Nations, and in that category I include the communist press itself. Now that shocks a lot of people, that I should say that the communist press or the communists are friendly to the United Nations, because everybody says, well, last year or a couple years ago I turned on my television set and there was a picture of nice big jolly Khrushchev, but he was mad. He was at the UN, he took off his shoe and he banged the table and he says, I hate the UN. So see, how could the communists like the UN? I saw Khrushchev say he didn't like it. But when the television cameras go off and the newspaper reporters go home and the photographers close up their cameras, Khrushchev puts his shoe back on again. And things become a little different. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to know what the communists really think about the United Nations. Don't watch their interviews for press conferences, which are designed for your consumption, and by that I mean the average American. Read what they say about the United Nations in their own periodicals, which is designed for readership by members of the Communist Party. Now, I have the unpleasant experience of reading The Worker, The People's World, Political Affairs, the New Marxist Review, and all of that sort of thing. I even read it before American Opinion because I've got to keep up with that. And it's a horrible experience. And I've got a file cabinet that won't quit with communist literature, which reminds me, I must inform the FBI of this. But anyway, this is where you go to find out what the communists really think. Now, I'll just give you two little examples. Go to your main library. I'm sure in town here, your main library will have a copy of the Constitution of the Communist Party in the United States. And in the preamble of the Constitution of the American Communist Party, you will find these words. The Communist Party of the United States holds that the true national interests of our country require the strengthening of the United Nations, period. The Worker, on January 21st, 1962, in a dandy little article by Mike Newberry, good friend of ours. Article was headlined, "Birchers Take Warpath Against UN Peace Hopes." Here's what the communists said then. The John Birch Society has instructed its members to prepare a hate campaign against the United Nations. Its obvious aim is to undermine the faith of the American people in the United Nations. Now, the origins of this insidious business, say the communists, the origins of this insidious business can be traced to a so-called United States Day committee, the purpose of which was to replace United Nations Day with United States Day. Isn't that horrible? And if we had the time, I could talk for 2 hours just reading little quotations like this out of the communist press. They defend the United Nations down to the very bitter end, every chance they have. And once again, I'm proud to say that the John Birch Society in this stand, as in most stands, is 100% on the opposite side of the issue. Now, why am I opposed to the United Nations? Why do I think we ought to get out? It's one thing to say the communists are for it. All right, that's not a conclusive argument. Just because the communists are for something, or say they are for something, is not reason enough. It's a good indication, but it's not reason enough for us to be against it. We must have solid, valid reasons of our own, and we do. Mr. Barron has pointed out 9 very good reasons. I approach it from a little different angle. Instead of taking the specifics, I've made them into general categories, but you come out with the same answer either way. And I say that there are 4 general reasons why I want to get out of the United Nations. 1, I'll give them to you first in succession, then I'll come back and offer a little evidence to prove what I'm talking about. And by the way, I've made these points as extremist sounding as I could, because if there's anybody asleep here, I want to jar them and get them awake, see. Now, if you want to snicker as I go through these things, go right ahead. That's all right, because then we'll come back and we'll have a chance to look at some of the evidence. And I know these will sound rather wild to some, perhaps not in this audience, but you see, I was broken in Rochester. And and I think in terms of that kind of an audience. So here we go. 1, the United Nations was conceived by communists. By the way, this does not really conflict with what Mr. Byron says, as you'll see in a moment. 1, it was conceived by communists. 2, it was created by communists. 3, the United Nations is controlled by communists. And 4, the only logical conclusion of the first 3 is if it was conceived by, created by, is controlled by communists, the United Nations is furthering the cause of communism. What else? All right, now let's take a look at these 4 points and see what possible evidence there is. Now, I can't offer everything that I do in the book to support these arguments, but I'll offer just a little bit here. Now, first of all, to this first statement that the United Nations was conceived by communists. Now, the United Nations as an organization, as it is presently set up, certainly was not conceived by communists, because this thing dates back to the writings of Lenin. I had the unpleasant experience of looking for a particular quotation of Lenin's. I never did find it, by the way. I don't think it was ever valid. But it led me to the 23 or 27 volumes of the selected works of Lenin. I never realized the man wrote so much. He wrote almost as much as Robert Welch writes. I really laugh sometimes thinking of some future young fellow like myself researching something that Mr. Welch said, and thinking, well, that'll be a snap, and then getting to the library and there's a whole shelf full like this. But anyway, here's Lenin staring me in the library, and I actually went through just about everything that Lenin had ever written. And you find woven in and out of this material, of course, 90% of it you can toss out the window because it's all dealing with internal power struggles within the party in the early days of the Bolshevik Revolution. Who's going to be top dog and why, and theoretical arguments. But once in a while, Lenin gets into some strategy, world strategy, the plans for world conquest. How are we going to do it without risking our necks? How can we take over countries without fighting them, and so forth? And here you find in the works of Lenin the basic germ of the idea of taking over countries by first consolidating them into regional units and then bringing the regional units into a worldwide Soviet state. But it's just the germ of an idea there. You carry it forward, you find that this character, Joseph Stalin, who also was quite a prolific writer, I never thought of Stalin as being much of a writer, but he's written plenty. He takes Lenin's basic idea and expands it considerably and brings it much closer to home, especially in his one book called Nationalism and the Colonial Question. And there he begins to narrow it down very closely. You can see the framework of the United Nations beginning to develop. And of course, by the time we get to 1945, a lot has happened. A lot has happened. As Mr. Byron has already pointed out, we have the red warts already in Washington, in our own State Department, supposedly representing our interests, working to create the United Nations. They've been at it for years. But just to show you that I'm not talking about all of this just out of my head here, I don't know how many of you recognize this, and those of you who can't read it, it's Political Affairs. Now, this is a communist periodical. It's not a communist periodical because I'm just saying so. I mean, I'm not making an irresponsible statement now. This is a communist periodical because they say it's a communist periodical. They're very proud of it. It's published by the New Century Publishers in New York, which is the official publishing house of the Communist Party. There's an article in here by Stalin, an article in here called A Program for Developing Communist Cadres. Very interesting thing in the back page here, just published, The Soviet Spirit by Dr. Harry F. Ward, head of the Union Theological Seminary. Very interesting, these things, especially when you go back to April 1945, which this one is. Now, what was happening in 1945 in April? Well, we all know here, there was a little organization in San Francisco being hammered together by all the idealists. They were going to create a world in which there was going to be no more war. Our last best hope for peace was finally being put together. Were the communists interested in it? Of course they were interested in it. They were building it, as we'll get to in just a moment. And all the while that Joseph Stalin was saying, I don't want to be part of it, here is what the Communist Party in the United States was instructing the members of the Communist Party to do. In a feature article, here are the instructions right from the communists themselves. The major question for us in connection with the San Francisco Conference is to assure the adherence of the United States to the World Security Organization. We have come a long way along this path, but the final battle has not yet been won, although we are in an extremely favorable position to destroy the remaining bridgeheads of opposition. At the time of the Moscow Conference in October 1943, that was the Crimea Declaration, by the way, in which it was decided to have a United Nations. At that time, the Senate voted 85-5 in favor of United States participation in a World Security Organization, even changing the phraseology of its resolution to accord with the Moscow Declaration. Only the die-hard obstructionists voted against the resolution. Well, I wish we'd had a few more die-hard obstructionists in those days. But the article goes on. It says, building up vast popular support would create the best atmosphere for the United Nations meeting and for routing the opposition. After the charter is passed at San Francisco, it will have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate, and this action will establish a weighty precedent for other treaties and agreements still to come. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as I tried to devote a whole chapter and explain in this chapter in my book when you consider the other treaties and agreements which did follow this, this is a very prophetic statement. So let me repeat it. It will have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate, and this action will establish a weighty precedent for other treaties and agreements still to come. But the victory cannot be won in the Senate alone. Great popular support and enthusiasm for the United Nations policies should be built up, well organized, and fully articulate. But it is also necessary to do more than that. The opposition must be rendered so impotent that it will be unable to gather any significant support in the Senate against the United Nations Charter. Need I say that they succeeded beyond their wildest expectations? The opposition was rendered so impotent that right up to the very present it is still very, very impotent, although there are encouraging signs that there is a renewed awakening. All right, the communists did conceive this thing, and this does not refute the fact that there were many, many idealists who were promoting and conceiving an idea of the United Nations who were not communists. But you know, I'm sure that most of you men here, and I know all of you ladies, understand a certain little philosophy. I just celebrated my 11th wedding anniversary last weekend, and the longer I get into this thing, the more I begin to realize certain things happened to me 11 years ago that I didn't realize then. You know the old expression, I chased her till she caught me. Well, ladies and gentlemen, when the United Nations was formed, we chased the communists until they caught us. And that's exactly what happened. Of course, there were a lot of people doing the chasing who didn't realize it until it was too late. All right, let me go on to point number 2. I said my next extremist type statement was that the United Nations was created by communists. Well, now there really is a wild statement, because the record clearly shows that the United Nations was conceived primarily within the American government, primarily within the State Department, and to a lesser extent within the Treasury Department, and also in the executive branch of government. So what I am just saying then is that there were communists in our government? Well, take a look at the record. Mr. Barron has already mentioned a very interesting book called Post-War Foreign Policy Preparation, put out by the State Department. And as he also mentioned, it was watered down considerably. You will not find reference to Alger Hiss being a member of the San Francisco Conference or being Secretary General of it. He's mentioned all right, but boy, is he relegated to a very small corner. And there are a lot of people who are relegated, and you have to dig and dig to get any facts at all. But in spite of that handicap, you start making a list of the men and women who, according to such documents put out by the departments themselves, who were responsible for creating the United Nations policies within our own government, and make a list of them, you'll find that every one of these people listed by these departments, except one, have since been identified in sworn testimony as secret agents of the communist conspiracy. Fantastic as that sounds. And who was the exception? Dean Acheson. Take heart. Everyone but one. Now, Alger Hiss was perhaps the best known of these. I think there's a tendency to overemphasize the role that Alger Hiss played in the creation of the United Nations. I think some critics of the UN tend to make it look like the UN was built single-handedly by Alger Hiss, and they play too heavily, I think, on it. On the other hand, the defenders of the UN try to play it down. They like to pretend like he wasn't even there, and he was a very important figure. Mr. Byron has pointed out, and I keep referring to his excellent summary of Mr. Hiss because he knows from first-hand experience. I'm just a researcher in this thing. In fact, I wasn't even awake more than about 5 years ago. But just researching into the documents, for instance, what I have here is a photostatic copy of Time magazine, date April 16, 1945. It's very interesting to go back and read some of these old things in the libraries. Now, in 1945, in April 16, Alger Hiss was not very well known. And down here in the corner, there's a very innocuous little article, and here's what it says. The Secretary General for the San Francisco Conference was named at Yalta but announced only last week. Lanky, Harvard-trained Alger Hiss, one of the State Department's brighter young men. Alger Hiss was one of the Harvard Law School students whose records earned them the favor of Professor, now Justice of the Supreme Court, Felix Frankfurter, and a year as secretary to the late Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was drafted from a New York law firm by the New Deal in 1933. He joined the State Department in 1936, accompanied President Roosevelt to Yalta. At San Francisco, Alger Hiss will be an important figure. As Secretary General managing the agenda, he will have a lot to say about who gets the breaks behind the scenes. Isn't that an interesting statement? I think it was very, very revealing, and I'm sure that some people would like to rip all of these pages out of all the library editions of Time magazine. But bear in mind what I said a moment ago. Alger Hiss was not alone. He did not build the UN single-handedly. If he had never been born, or if he had spent his whole life in a monastery someplace, the UN would still be exactly the same as it is today, because there were plenty of others, Harry Dexter White, Laughlin Currie, Thomas Dugan, and many, many others who were working right along with Alger Hiss during the formation of the UN. Now, extremist statement number 3. The United Nations is controlled by communists. Now, how can I say that? Take a look at the members of the UN. Why, the communist bloc countries can only muster about 12 or 13 votes. And what are there now, 113, 114 members in the 115, I guess. I can't keep track. They keep splitting up all these countries about the size of Detroit and giving them membership, and yet you have a country the size of Katanga, which is larger than France, and they say it can't stand alone economically. They won't give it independence. But anyway, all these members and all the communist bloc countries can muster is about 12 or 13. So how can I say they control the UN? Well, first of all, any student of the United Nations very quickly comes to the conclusion that the real power and the real control of the United Nations does not reside so much in the corridors and among the delegates in the lounge and so forth, the voting delegates, as it does in the permanent full-time staff of employees known as the Secretariat. These are the faceless bureaucrats that can take the bite out of any resolution passed by the Security Council or the General Assembly, or can put teeth into those which were never intended to bite. These are the people who make the organization run and make it the advancing edge of world authority, as Connor Cruz O'Brien, one of these people, has called it so proudly. There is where you will find control of the United Nations in the Secretariat, and to some degree, of course, in the voting delegation as well. So let's take a look at the composition of the Secretariat. Now, what's the strongest anti-communist country in the world? We like to think it's the United States. You can't very well argue that there is any stronger or more militant anti-communist nation in the world than our country. So let's take a look at our own delegation and see what it looks like from here. During the Korean War, a New York grand jury was hearing testimony on something entirely unrelated, and all of a sudden one of the persons testifying let slip some information which indicated that there just might be somebody on the staff of the United Nations Secretariat among the American quota who was not quite loyal to the United States. And it alarmed these people, and they decided to check into it further. In fact, they conducted an entire investigation on that one subject itself. This hit the newspaper somewhat, it aroused public interest, and at the same time, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee decided to conduct its own investigation of the exactly same situation, but independently. And both of these investigations, for a time, were going on overlapping each other. And they both came out with exactly the same conclusions. Now, what I have in my hands here is a very hard-to-find copy of a publication put out by the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee entitled Activities of United States Citizens Employed in the United Nations. And this is the testimony, ladies and gentlemen, of the Americans who were working at the United Nations as part of our quota before the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee. And it's enough to make you ill. If you have the stamina, it takes about a full day to read it word for word, or it does me anyway. Here you have men and women, each of whom has willingly and gladly pledged allegiance and loyalty to the United Nations. They must do this in order to be accepted as an employee of the Secretariat. And yet, 9 out of 10 of them refused to acknowledge a loyalty to the United States of America. They pled the Fifth Amendment. And so what do you come up with? At the end of all of this, the New York grand jury made its presentment, and it is included in the appendix of this particular report. And this is a very significant sentence from that indictment, or presentment rather. And it said this: "This jury must, as a duty to the people of the United States, advise the court that startling evidence has disclosed infiltration into the United Nations of an overwhelmingly large group of disloyal United States citizens, many of whom are closely associated with the international communist movement. This group numbers scores of individuals, most of whom have long records of federal employment, and at the same time have been connected with persons and organizations subversive to this country. Their positions at the time we subpoenaed them were ones of trust and responsibility in the United Nations Secretariat and in its specialized agencies. They did not bother subpoenaing the waitresses and the janitors. These were high-level people that they were looking at, heads of departments, people who were considered professional status." And finally, in the middle of the Senate report, Senator Eastland, who at that time was acting chairman, made this statement, which rather summarizes the findings of the whole committee. He said, "After reading the record of these hearings to date and acting as chairman during the last 2 sessions, I must say that I am appalled at the extensive evidence indicating that there is today in the United Nations, among the American employees there," and please listen to this next part very carefully, "the greatest concentration of communists this committee has ever encountered." And that is quite a statement when you consider the concentration of communists this committee has encountered. Now, has it changed? That was 1952. That's a long time ago. It's ancient history. Has it changed? Well, let's take a look at the record. Some of these employees who were involved in these reports were released. They were fired. A UN tribunal heard the case, ordered them reinstated. Those that wanted their jobs back got them back with back pay. Those who did not want their jobs back were given cash indemnities, some of them as high as $40,000 each. There has been no cleaning out of subversives from the United Nations since then. So you answered the question, how stands the situation today? Now, if it's that bad or potentially that bad, we don't know. There haven't been any investigations of this kind. We don't know. All we can go on is past record and our crystal ball, and my crystal ball is unplugged. I don't know who's in the UN, who is loyal or unloyal, and we won't know until we have investigations. We won't have investigations until you demand them. But what is the situation today? If it's that bad or possibly that bad with the United States delegation, think of what it might be like with the delegations or the quota in the Secretariat from the other nations of the world who are not nearly as militantly anti-communist as we are. Ponder that for a moment. Take France, for instance. Now, here is France. The communists have really pulled a fast one there. They've convinced the French people that they're a legitimate political party. They're on the ballot, you know. And sitting today in the House of Parliament in France, there are more official members of the Communist Party. That's not counting the secret ones who don't let on that they're communists, who are in the other parties, but officially, open and above members of the Communist Party, more of them in the French Parliament than any other single political party. And they hold the balance of power. Do you think there might be a communist or two in the quota from France? In the French Constitution, it is specifically illegal to bar communists from holding government jobs. The same is true in Italy. Exactly the same is true in Italy. Even in England, ladies and gentlemen, which is one of our NATO allies, and we consider them as staunchly anti-communist, it is not illegal for a communist to hold a government job in England, provided it's a non-sensitive job. And needless to say, the delegation or the quota to the UN is not considered a sensitive position. And it should surprise nobody to find out that a few years ago, another investigation of the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee revealed that in New York City, 2 delegates, formal delegates of the United Nations, one from France and one from India, attended Communist Party headquarters and lectured party leaders in this country on how to solve problems in disseminating communist propaganda. Now, these are accredited delegates, not the Secretariat, but official delegates from France and India. So I repeat, with just that much evidence, there's much more. Number 3, the United Nations, rather, is controlled by the communists. Well, I'm rapidly nearing the end of this, so let me move very quickly over the 4th point, which is that it has furthered the advance of communism. Well, that, I think, is fairly obvious. Just look at the case of Katanga. The first section of my book, I've devoted 6 chapters just to that one case of Katanga. And if that doesn't tell the story, then nothing will. I think people should ask why it is that since the United Nations was created in 1945, supposedly to prevent the rise of another world-grasping tyrannical power such as Nazism, right during that time, an equally tyrannical power, or far more tyrannical power, communism, has risen right up through the United Nations and conquered more land, enslaved more people, committed more political murders, created more horror and atrocities than Hitler ever came close to at the zenith of his career, and the United Nations will not even discuss it in the Security Council or the General Assembly. Why not? Well, ladies and gentlemen, as I reach the end of this thing, I think in terms of what we're celebrating here over this weekend, the 4th of July. It takes me back to 188 years ago. I was going to say 1888. It takes me back 188 years ago to that time in history when I first became interested in American history, reading on Patrick Henry with his fiery "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. And as was mentioned in my introduction, I'm very fascinated with this part of our American history, long before I ever became aware that we were reliving it again today. And I'm very emotionally involved in that part of history, and I think of that group of men sitting there deliberating over the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and I think of what was at stake. You know, these people were pretty well off, most of those men. They were prominent, they were landowners, they had it made, and here they were going against the established bureaucracy. They weren't particularly worried about whether or not their boy might lose a job, as you said, or worried about any of these other things. They had everything to lose. They were signing their own death warrants in this thing. How could these weak colonies, these inexperienced farmers, ever hope to win a war against Great Britain, which had the greatest and most powerful military force in the entire world? What chance did they have? The odds were against it. They had everything to lose, including their lives, and nothing to gain except their independence. And I think the next time we hear somebody belittle the thought of independence or sovereignty, we should just stop and think and reflect for a moment that that is the one single accomplishment of the American Revolution. That's what it was all about. And it makes me a little ill when I pick up my current copy of the State Department Bulletin that I get every week. And just a few weeks ago, I read a speech by Secretary of State Dean Rusk, dated May 9, 1964. And here is what our Secretary of State said. Our people see quite clearly now that the interests they cherish, which once national sovereignty was presumed to preserve, are better shared and assured through collective action. For compelling and practical reasons, the notion of national independence each day gives more ground to the principle of interdependence. At least as it appears to us in the United States, We have never been less sovereign, less independent in our history, because our freedom of action is rigorously circumscribed by our responsibilities and the interests of others. And so we are coming to the point where we almost cannot understand the revival of the notion of independence in dealing with the affairs of the free world, because we have almost none of it ourselves. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if this is true, and I suspect it is, we are right back to where the shooting began in 1775. Now, you compare those words to those powerful words of John Adams that I was so delighted to hear quoted in full by Dan Smoot yesterday. You consider that here were these men with all of these circumstances that I just described, and John Adams stands up, and I'm sure he had a lump in his throat. He'd been thinking about this for a long time, and he said, "Live or die, survive or perish, I am for the Declaration. It is my living sentiment, and by the grace of God, it shall be my dying sentiment. Independence now, and independence forever." Now, I don't know, ladies and gentlemen, which one of these two men that I've just quoted speaks for you. But I do know that in spirit I stand with John Adams. And the only last thing I want to say to you is that I hope and pray that you will stand with me with John Adams and pledge your lives, your fortunes, and your sacred honor to God and country and to independence now, and independence forever. Thank you.